the Inspire project is really focused on how do we develop interventions with stakeholders. And in particular, we're looking at how do we support young girls, so adolescents between the ages of 16 and 19, to have good mental health during their pregnancy and also in the year after birth. And so the kind of focus of that within Mozambique and within Kenya is first understanding their lives. What are the experiences that they're having? What are the challenges? Not particularly saying this is mental health, but what are the things that are happening around them? Because we know that the challenges they're facing will have an impact on their mental health. And so if we can think tangibly about what are the things that we can do to alleviate some of the pressing problems that they're experiencing, there is this idea that that will have a knock-on effect on their mental health and either be able to strengthen it and reduce their vulnerability to a mental health issue during that time. So what we're trying to do is first understand that bit. What is it that is the challenge? And understand that from the perspective of the young mother, also from her family members, so partners, heads of households. These are people who are kind of integral to a young girl's life, and especially at this stage of her life. And they also have the power to either support or hinder her involvement and participation in any or sort of intervention. So we have to understand what their perspective is and what they want and what they think is important for her and for their households, their families. Also talking to service providers about what their jobs are, where they see kind of the boundaries between what they should be doing and what is kind of someone else's remit. And that's also then to understand what sorts of interventions might be most appropriate for what sorts of settings. Also talking to policy level participants, stakeholders, because we want to make sure that this is something that is sustainable and can be backed by local governments and potentially national governments. So really understanding their perspective and what is meaningful and important to them at this point in time can help us to kind of situate an intervention and potentially say, okay, you have these priorities and this intervention will help you with X, Y, and Z. And in that way, you kind of bring them on board, help them, and it helps you as researchers to figure out what are the things that are most likely going to stick and most likely going to have high buy-in and kind of champions and leadership so that when research funding ends, things can kind of keep moving. As well as others within the community. So we call them community influencers. So people who have status in the community, so that might be a community leader, it might be a religious leader, it might be a traditional healer. So people who have an air of respect within that community, and also that the young girls or their families might listen to, because you don't want to develop something and somebody says, oh, that's not great. We wouldn't do that, because that has, a big impact then on potential uptake and the success of your intervention. So it's really thinking about who are those stakeholders who will either make or break an intervention and including them at the start so that we understand who they are, what their relationships are with the other stakeholders, and what it is that they see as the challenge and potential solutions to the problems that these young girls are facing. And then we'll move on to working with the stakeholders to agree a priority. So there will inevitably be multiple issues that are going on, but what is something that is feasible to address, practical to address, and also important enough to address to make potentially a meaningful difference to the lives of these girls, their families, and the communities. And once we have that, then it's kind of everyone's job to really think about how can we address this challenge. And I think, this is where it kind of differs from a lot of traditional methods of intervention development, where it's very much kind of led by the researchers. So this is kind of led by us, but I would say it's more facilitated by the research group. And really, it is trying to put ownership and autonomy into the hands of the community so that they can come up with potential ideas, and we can blend that in with the things that we know from our kind of academic or research or clinical backgrounds as to what are kind of components that can be useful in addressing these problems, but potentially package those existing, evidence-based interventions or components of those interventions in ways that are attractive and meaningful to these stakeholder groups. So coming up with these ideas, really bouncing them off everyone and seeing what sticks, and then moving on to what I think is probably the most exciting part of this method, which is the prototyping. So not just coming up with an idea and then going straight into testing it, but actually working with it and showing it to people and saying, this is what we think it might look like. This is, the person who would deliver an intervention. This is where you might, where it might take place. These are the types of people that would be involved. And just getting, their initial gut reactions to this. Is it something where they go, oh gosh, it's making me cringe, or I'd never do that, or this is really great. Can we do this tomorrow? And using that to really refine the intervention before we get to testing, so that we know if there are things that off the bat are going to cause an issue, we want to know that beforehand. We don't want to integrate that into an intervention because that could be a fatal flaw. So the more people we're able to show it to, the better we're able to make sure that whatever we test has the best chance of being useful and successful. And then we'll move on to a pilot where we'll kind of intensively provide this intervention or the solution, whatever you'd like to call it, to a group of young women and or potentially their families as well, depending on who we decide is actually going to be the beneficiaries and the participants in the intervention. And really try to dissect, what's working, what needs to be changed, and continue that refinement and collect data so that we can see, what is happening and what's working and what's not, so that by the end of it, if it's shown to be something that looks like it's of substance and can actually help, then we're ready to go, potentially to a trial.